transportation, enough types of opportunities for people to work and live.
When I was on the council, I was the city's rep to the League of California Cities. And their studies, these are statewide studies, not Alameda studies, but their studies showed that if you build high-rise, only 30% of the people who live there will take public transportation. So when you build high-rise, that means that 70% will get in their cars. Now, this is a statewide thing, but I'm saying that probably Alameda isn't that far from those numbers. People tend not to sell their houses because the price of housing keeps going up. And even with some of the Prop 13 forgiveness, when you exchange houses, people tend to stay put in their houses, but they do change jobs. I know in my last permanent job, I was commuting to the eastern end of the San Mateo Bridge, the business park there. And it took me 25 minutes by car, or 2.5 hours by public transit. So you can't, and I think our housing elements show that we have a lot of people, not only work in San Francisco, but that also work in Oakland. But you can't provide public transit. Once you get past a couple of changes, actually once you get past one change, people just don't take public transit. And this is one reason I'm glad our own ferry system allows bicycles. We're not like BART. You can't take your bikes along during commute hours. So we actually promote good popular public transit use with our ferry system.
Thank you.
I know Richard has a question, and I think Bill in the back.
Okay. As we all know, the Southern Crossing was not built when they built out Bay Farm Island. And unfortunately, you see what the people who live over in Bay Farm know that the jam up that has occurred, traffic jam, just like 80, going to the 880. Okay, what happens if they build out, if we don't have Measure A to protect Alameda Point? There's only 4 lanes on the Posey Tube. What happens to Alameda Point if there's no Measure A to stop huge condos or apartments that developers would love to build, would love to get their hands on once the Alameda Point is converted over to the city? And Webster Street could end up like San Francisco, like downtown SF. We don't want that. It's already jamming up in the morning out there on Atlantic, making the left turn to try to go through the Posey Tubes. What answer would you ladies like to give as far as the transportation problem? I know some of it's been covered already, which I thank you. But,
well, I partially answered that when I talked about the statewide percentage of people who live in high-rises who actually take public transportation. You will produce a lot more cars. And by the way, somebody mentioned the WRT study for Alameda Point. And it's all based, that whole study was, that presentation was based on the fact that our ferry is going to move from the estuary to the lagoon. And one of the staff members kind of indicated that somehow Oakland was going to abandon that ferry. In fact, the ferry is economically feasible, and we can keep it going because we share it with Port of Oakland. Even though the Port of Oakland is very unhelpful, we do get their passengers. There are a lot of people that get on in Oakland. And if we try to switch to a ferry that we don't share with Oakland, it may or may not survive economically. I know the Harbor Bay ferry requires a very light subsidy per passenger. It's smaller now, but it started out at $9 for a one-way ticket. That was a subsidy, not the price. And so we were at one point paying an $18 subsidy for a round trip on the Harbor Bay ferry. It's gotten down quite a bit, but it's still, there's quite a subsidy going on for an Alameda-only ferry. So we have to watch these plans as far as I was concerned, the WRT plan that was based around only having a ferry on the lagoon system was pie in the sky. I don't think it's economically possible. That's one person's opinion, but I ask you all to investigate this and look into the economics of such a system yourself, rather than just accept the fact that somebody says we're going to move the ferry. And I've heard some very good questions tonight, so I think we have people in this audience who do ask questions.
You're absolutely right, because that's my admonition to all of you, is to inform yourselves. And I don't know about the ferry either. That's part of the WRT study, is they're looking into how that works out, but we do need to keep an eye on all those proposals. The idea of huge condos producing lots of drivers is offset by the studies that really show that big houses with 3-car garages produce an awful lot of traffic. And the 30% that Barbara's talking about, riding transit, would be a huge target for every city to achieve, getting that many people out of their cars. And I know people are working on a lot of solutions. Again, we're talking about not today, we're talking about 20 years in the future and goals that we're trying to aim at to achieve these. But I think that there's another fallacy floating around, is about developers. And there's a misunderstanding that developers will make a bigger profit if they can build more and different types of housing. This has really become studied a lot, because there's an article right now in Why Building Smart is So Hard in the Next American City magazine that really establishes the fact that developers say you're not going to make as much money in the same time frame as you would by building all single-family homes or a power center. That premise that socially good building can compete with mass production is false. It can't, it won't, and never will. So developers really do want to build the big houses. They do sell very quickly and very readily, and it's going to take the stiff backbones of our city council to see that that doesn't become what happens at Alameda Point. However it is accomplished, whether it's through a lot of Marina Village lookalikes or what it is, or removing Measure A from that part of the city, and really doing planned future development forecasting for that area. And I don't think we've ever really done that. We need to.
So about 5 minutes, so I know Bill, and then John, and Joanne, and Barb. We can get all 4 in 5 minutes.
First, a quick comment about bikes on BART. I take my bike on BART very, very frequently during rush hour, but I'm one of those commuters going south and east. Then I have two things that I wanted to ask you about. One of them is my observation that whatever is developed at Alameda Point, whether it's single family or it's condos and townhouses and the tall apartment buildings, the number of units is going to be determined by what the traffic will bear. And so even the single-family housing building out there will overload the tunnel if you put in too much of it. So it's really not a question of whether, for traffic, it's not a question of whether it's single-family or condos. It's a question of how do we agree, do we trust our government to control and limit the number of whatever is built out there. And so I wanted to ask both of you, and I've been active in the Sierra Club, and we certainly know how to sue to help enforce limits on that. So I wanted to ask both of you, what would it take to convince you that the city would be able to control the number of units that are built out there to manage traffic at the point?
Well, I think you're right. The total number of housing does control the traffic, and also the number of jobs out there will control traffic. We all remember the Navy days. The Navy itself had the perfect work-live situation. They lived on the base a lot of time on the carriers, and they worked there. But the Naval Aviation Depot employees did not live at the base. And you couldn't get out of town through the tube after 3 in the afternoon. I think we all remember that. So unfortunately, the traffic studies that the city does leave me in despair because they don't really look at the livability of our streets and how we can get in and out of town. The WRT people just didn't seem to have a clue that we have the tube and we've got some bridges and that's it, and that's the only way we can come and go. And we know that everybody who lives here doesn't kind of work here. So how we get to the council members not to accept the pretty silly EIRs that come through bother me. What bothers me in the next council meeting is the North Waterfront General Plan Amendment, and they're talking about a work-live of maybe 200 units in the Del Monte building, and with no control over what kind goes in the rest of the building. We saw that at Clamp Swing. And so what kind of traffic is that? Work-live is not supposed to generate any traffic, but it does. People live there. And the parking situation, if they go into that building and say, well, we're going to have 200 work-live and we're going to have a Zen meditation center for the rest of it, and then once they get their use permit, they say, oh, well, we decided to bring a Target instead. And we have a staff that says, well, it's over 10 years old, so we don't require parking. That ignores the good neighbor provisions that I was one of the people that got put into the work-live ordinance. And so they are willing to break the law. And so watch what happens Tuesday night on the North Waterfront GPA. Are they, I haven't read the staff report yet, but are they going to put in methods whereby the good neighbor provisions, the golden rule provisions that we wrote into the work-live situation, are they going to require that they be lived up to in the Del Monte building? I'm very concerned about that. Again, I'm getting a little bit off, but we're talking about traffic, we're talking about parking, and if they don't do it, you won't be able to use Little John Park because all the cars from whatever commercial enterprise they will take up all the parking. And so that very popular park will become unusable. There, that's a little soapbox from Barbara, who lives on the north side, and I'm very fond of my neighborhood. But I hope it also is somewhat of an answer to your question.
My suggestion is that we have vigilance in all of these things that we do. The agreements with the developer, the agreements that they'll put these things in place, whether it's height or density or what it is something that we all need to examine very carefully, whether it's Measure A compliant or not. Obviously there's more leeway for different densities and different heights and all, not heights, they'll be the same one way or the other, but the ability to have housing over retail, that sort of thing, will be written into those agreements. The EIRs, I guess I can't laugh off because I have seen too many projects changed by citizens protesting against the EIR not being complete or not looking at the issues correctly. And I also have an inherent trust in people that I elect, that I vote for. So I guess those things give me some different viewpoint perhaps than others have. But I really want to say that there are controls, there will be controls. There will be a development plan adopted for Alameda Point. If the Navy auctions off the land, I don't know that will occur. But if we have a developer that's going to reach an agreement with the City Council, the ARA, they will need to adhere to that plan. And we have a better chance of having good controls if the city is the one who makes that selection of the developer. Does that answer?
Well, that's a partial answer. The citizen vigilance is the only thing that really works in the long run. That's my opinion. The second part of my question.
I want to make one short comment. Eternal vigilance is not possible with all these closed sessions. When I first got on the city council, we had almost no closed sessions. And during those 8 years between a mayor and a city manager who wanted to do everything in closed sessions, the public couldn't exercise eternal vigilance. They were presented with an accomplished fact at one open meeting. And so I'm going to ask all of you, whatever your political viewpoint is let's get rid of this constant and almost universal closed session, because we didn't used to do that.
My second thing I'd like to do is, I've been very upset by watching some of the new developments around that Jim brought up, where you've got the house that takes up the entire lot, and some of them you see this much space between them. They're not 0 lot lines, they're 6-inch lot lines, or something like that, and that just looks awful to me. And I'm thinking that, and somebody else said a single story for people getting older, and I'm thinking that if instead of having that artificial 6-inch, you go right ahead and combine those into duplexes or triplexes or quadplexes or 5plexes or whatever, and make them single family, and save a little bit of the room out from the 2,000 square foot to put in park and public spaces shared between them. You could have a pretty attractive complex. And you could actually do that without a city charter amendment. The city council could do that, because in the ordinances for the city council, it says that it defines what multifamily is, and it's defined by ordinance passed by the city council that multifamily is 2 units. And you could certainly define multifamily to be a larger number of units. There's precedent for 3 units, and there's some people that believe you could even push it as far as 5 or 6 units. Beyond that, I don't think there would be any. So I wanted to comment on, or either of you have comments on maybe not the feasibility, but the desirability of having the triplexes, quadplexes, or whatever in there, and not worry for the moment about the feasibility of doing it, how we get done.
Excellent idea from my point of view. I don't know how much litigation has been money spent by certain people suing to build on a 3-unit parcel, but I do know that there's quite a bit that's been spent, taxpayers' money as well as personal. And it's an interesting idea, Bill. We're faced with the fact that within the next few months, there will probably be a decision made to go forward with 1,700 units, 2,000 units, a certain number of units, and the likelihood of getting something like that through the courts and accomplished in a timely manner is probably highly unlikely. I would love to see something other than having to make a charter change, because my view also extends to not having to spend a lot of time and effort on that. And I would love to be able to see the community come together around something like that proposal, rather than having to educate people and ask them to look at changing Measure A, which is certainly one of the heartfelt principles of Alamedians. Thank you.
Bill, you're very familiar with, I think it's Ravens Cove or Ravenswood Cove.
I own a home out there.
That's what I thought. And that's a very good example of clustered open space. Some of those buildings have 3 units in them, but the garages are all clustered. And so therefore they're able to cluster the open space and natural flow of people into the bay. For the people who don't know what we're talking about, if you drive down Otis, and before you get to the Bay Farm Island Bridge, turn right, and you'll see these stories, and their shared lawn is very pleasant. It has barbecues and tables and things like that. So when they're Measure A compliant, it could be done in a Measure A compliant way. And I wish we would, and I wish we'd get rid of these huge garages all attached to the house, because I think clustered garages make more sense if they can be hidden as well as they are at that place.
We're
we agree on that one. Those are called snout houses in Portland, Oregon, and they forbid them being built that have the garage. You don't know where the front door is, and all you see is the garage. And I'm sure we can find other things that we agree on. We seem to have found a number tonight. I did want to indicate that we brought some information that we wanted to share with you. A newsletter that is here, a Measure A quiz, true or false, to help your education, Jim. And some other material will be set back there, which is the statement of purpose of homes and what we hope to achieve. Thank you.
John?
So my question kind of goes back to something Bill was touching on, and I think something that Barbara was saying. Measure A can't be changed except by the will of the voters. And no matter what the number, let's say at Alameda Point, it's kind of a two-part question, but whether it's 1,700, which is the current plan under Measure A, or 3,000 or 1,000 or whatever else, if the voters were to change, what would be the concern with changing Measure A to allow to limit the number of homes to whatever the Measure A compliant plan is, but then use density to reduce the amount of traffic generated by that number of homes? And I ask because there's a lot of study, 30 years of study, that shows that the denser the housing, the less trips per household that are generated, to the point that houses that are outside of a quarter mile from a transit stop and don't work near a transit stop use transit about 4% of the time, whereas households that are within a quarter mile of a transit stop and work within a quarter mile of a transit stop use transit 42% of the time. So if we were to limit the number of houses based on whatever the plan is, we could say 1,700 for the sake of tonight because that's what our current preliminary development concept is. What is the problem with finding a way to amend Measure A to limit the entire point to that number of houses, but change the density so that we get some of the benefits of walkable communities and higher transit usage and more integrated communities? And my follow-up to that is that at Alameda Landing, we have 300 households going in. We have reuse of these buildings along the waterfront, and yet we can't put households in those buildings along with the commercial, which would allow for a more vibrant after-hours and weekend-oriented waterfront along these paths that are going in. And so you're going to have currently basically big commercial buildings that have nobody in them on the weekend facing these hidden waterfront pathways, which are very uncomfortable to a lot of people. So what would be the concern with something like that?
Well, John, all you have to do is to go out and get the signatures and put it on the ballot.
No, I understand that. I'm curious, but you seem to have some concerns with that type of... And
I've already said it several times, and I say it all the time. I want people-friendly housing, not bus-friendly housing.
I'm not sure that's useful.
Okay, do we have the last couple? I think we're kind of like running overtime. Last two want to... You have quick questions, or I think our panel is getting a little bit weary.
I am.
I promised them an hour, and they've gone an hour and a half.
Yeah, that's enough.
So,
You want to go to David? Anyone have a real pressing question they want to ask as a final one? All right, David.
All right, thank you. I'd just like to ask Ms. Sause, you said several times tonight that Holmes is advocating for changing Measure A.
For Alameda Point.
For Alameda Point. But I haven't actually heard how you want to change it, or to what. And I think there may be some fear, whether in this room or on the island, changing something and not knowing what's replacing it. And so I've heard several times you say you want to change it, but I'm not sure how or why. Not why, how.
Thank you. That's a very good question. The change that we are proposing is to exempt Alameda Point, very clearly defined piece of real estate, from Measure A's restriction and replace it with a development plan that embodies the elements that we've talked about, which will encourage diversity of housing, permit that, aggregation of open space so that it's usable in the ways that have been described here tonight as user-friendly, that type of issue that we would want to see achieved there, which the community has come before and together before and talked about in their reuse plan, and hopefully will refine for this next developer that's selected. But again, for Alameda Point only, we would suggest exempting it from Alameda's Measure A.
So with no other controls?
With
basically.
all kinds of other controls, which would be an adopted development plan, which would go along with that.
Last word?
Last word, once you get rid of Measure A at Alameda Point or any other place, then what happens is subject to 3 votes on the city council. The reason Measure A ended up in the charter is that people did not trust their city council. And quite frankly, after the present council, or maybe it was the next to last council, refused to sue Oakland on the Oak to 9th Street project, even though they sued us and Chinatown sued us, people kind of lost faith in who are they taking care of, the people in Oakland or the people in Alameda. There is a distrust in Alameda right now of the city council and the planning board. It may be justified, it may be completely misplaced, but it's there. And so you are asking people to have faith that if you remove Measure A from Alameda Point, that there will be a reliable city council that ensures there's adequate open space. And we know that the Oakland City Council doesn't do that because I just showed you some pictures of it. So you would be putting great faith in whoever gets elected. And that's kind of a big thing, that's a big thing to bite off.
Okay, one more last one.
I understand that concern. It's a prevalent concern. I'm not quite sure I understand why there are 3 votes that could overturn Measure A elsewhere. Oh, okay. My understanding is that Measure A stands unless amended, and it takes a city vote to change that in any way. So our exemption for Alameda Point, if you would determine that, would be one that the city would have to vote on and approve. No other part of the Alameda Island would be affected by that. As far as distrusting our decision makers, I guess that's maybe a broad statement of what you said, but the feeling that we don't have a decision-making body that would adhere to a development agreement that we've all seen developed and hopefully would approve of is a little scary. I hope we don't elect people that wouldn't adhere to that, but I'm afraid we're getting into the debate part here.
Yeah, we are.
So I want to thank you all. They're good questions. And watch your city government. Our form of government is a do-it-yourself project. I was always irritated by constituents who said, well, I didn't know that was going on. Excuse me. You have to read a newspaper. You have to read the city council agendas. You have to read the planning board. They're all online. Yeah, and you show up. And we agree on that. So whatever you do, remember that our form of government is a do-it-yourself government. And I lived in Argentina for a year and I saw a non-do-it-yourself government in operation. Believe me, ours is very precious. We want to save it. So it requires work, but work at it.
Again, let's have a hand for our guests, our speakers. Thank you. And I was a little bit nervous about having this, but I think it turned out okay, and I actually learned a lot. So, and thank you for all the thoughtful questions. And just, I know you kind of led into what I wanted to say, and I didn't even ask you, but you know, it's people like us that make our government the way that Barbara described it. And if you're new to this club, I encourage you to consider joining. We have meetings like this every month, either in this room or downstairs. Next month's speaker is Congressman Pete Stark. In the off-election years, we do things like hold meetings. We register voters. Richard, there were 4,000 new registered voters in Alameda from 2000 to 2004. And I think you had a lot to do with that, and 3,500 of them voted Democrat. So those are the things we do, and we may disagree on Measure A, we may disagree on Alameda Point, we may disagree on a lot of things, but at heart we're all Democrats, and we want to get Bush out, and we want to get Democrats in. So I encourage you to sign up, join our club, come to the meetings, help us with the campaign next year, and that's pretty much it. So thanks again very much for coming.
Thank you all for coming. Our next meeting is August 8th.